On December 2022, Sara Flounders invited Lee Siu Hin to New York, joining the Sanctions National Book Launching Tour. Community activists from 4 cities across the U.S. invited authors of the book, including Sara Flounders, Lee Siu Hin, and others, to speak at the local event. First stop is the Philadelphia. South Bronx, where Hostel's community college locate, is the poorest area in the New York City, has quickly gentrified by the real estate developers.
Why do you have to pay for tuition? You don't in other countries. Why is there no money for this? And why 3 years without a cafeteria? And even then, shouldn't the food be free?
Many countries' hardships has been related to the U.S. imperialism, not only directly military intervention, covert actions, and also all this kind of regime change, but simply also an embargo, a sanctions that have been imposed to the country that created the huge economic impact and also kind of psychological warfare that making people had all this kind of social upheaval and then all this kind of different kind of the society crisis that forcing them to leave the country. They're coming not only because of economic hardship, but also psychological warfare that people think U.S. is the best country in the world. After Trump president, that China's U.S. trade war imposed by U.S. to China against China using different kind of dozen, different, even hundreds different type of sanctions, embargo, even directly targeting a private company called Huawei, the high-tech company, kidnapping the CFO of the Huawei in Canada, saying that she's violated the Iran sanction at the US, then they can impose the long arm to anyone down to the knees to listen to. Need to listen, otherwise you're going to suffer major consequences. That is a racism. That is an imperialism. That's making people of color in other parts of developing countries thinking like a white people in the US is a superior.
We are an all-volunteer effort. And in addition to the printed copy, where we can send you a link when you order the book to the EPUB version, so you can read it on an e-reader, computer, or smartphone. And the digital edition is particularly useful for reaching activists living outside the U.S. because printing books is pretty expensive, and we can forward the EPUB file. We're really interested in providing tools for grassroots political activists who are fighting and mobilizing for change. And the sanctions really understand what a brutal weapon, because it's a crisis that hits the most vulnerable. It creates millions of small personal crises. Essential medicines for diabetes, for high blood pressure, for small infections. A broken bone can be a death penalty. Polluted, untreated water, because there's no chlorine, is deadly. In international law, the targeting of civilians is always and totally off limits, even in a shooting war, in the midst of a war. And yet, U.S. imperialism has perfected this form of siege warfare that deliberately targets civilians, and the most vulnerable civilians, the young, the old, the chronically sick, the poorest. The sanctions are racist. They overwhelmingly target people of color in the global South, and sanctions come back and hit us here. But the ability of the U.S. to enforce global domination is slipping. It's proof of its inability to enforce the devastating sanctions, the thousands of new sanctions on Russia and on China. The global South, the countries of Africa, Latin America, most of the countries of Asia, the formerly colonized world, are not complying with these thousands of sanctions imposed by the US and the European nations, the NATO members, the sanctions especially imposed on Russia. They need the grain, the energy, the resources, and the ability of the United States to create economic chaos has not succeeded. It is a shock to the powers that be here. The increased sanctions on China have a destructive impact on science and technology on a global scale. But cooperation is expanding among these sanctioned countries. We can look at the BRICS Plus, new levels of cooperation and trade agreements, the Belt and Road, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Problems are solved by cooperation and not by endless war and sanctions. They're solved by respect for sovereignty and independence and respect for different development paths, for multilateralism versus U.S. hegemony. Now, where do we stand in all this? Working people right here need their own voice. We can't be chained to the corporate media and the capitalist threats. There are new agreements this week with China and the Gulf states and all the Arab countries. There's excited talk of international currency involving the yuan and the ruble and the rupee, and all of this challenges the almighty US dollar. So the world is changing rapidly.
Earlier this month, the US, South Korea, and Japan imposed coordinated unilateral sanctions against North Korea after the US failed to levy new international sanctions against North Korea, also known by its official name, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or the DPRK. The US has imposed these sanctions in response to North Korea's missile launches this past year. North Korea is being cast as a pariah state, but in reality, the North Korean development of nuclear weapons is a strategy of deterrence against US imperial aggression. The US has occupied and demonized Korea ever since it achieved its independence from Imperial Japan. During the Korean War, US forces killed 3 to 5 million Koreans. This is a number that essentially amounts to genocide. The US dropped more aerial bombs on North Korea than it did in the entire Pacific theater of World War II. And to this day, the Korean War is not over, thanks to US interest in keeping Korea divided. The ceasefire signed in 1953 did not end the war. In fact, and while sanctions are just one part of the imperialist playbook, their effects can be devastating. One of the most sanctioned countries in the world, North Korea can't trade with other countries, receive international loans, or import fuel or much of anything else. From agriculture to industry, sanctions impact all aspects of life in North Korea. Most things North Koreans need, they have to produce for themselves. There is no getting it from somewhere else. Sanctions impact water, sanitation, hygiene, and healthcare infrastructure. According to UNICEF, over 9.75 million people do not have access to safely managed drinking water. Crucially, one of the many types of items that North Korea is banned from importing due to sanctions is water sanitation equipment. Under sanctions, seeds, fertilizers, and agricultural equipment and other types of machinery are banned. And contrary to popular narratives that claim North Korea's government is intentionally withholding food from its population, food insecurity in the country is driven by a lack of access to modern agricultural equipment and techniques, and is amplified by natural disasters and the impacts of climate change. The US condemns human rights in North Korea, yet in the same breath, it violates those very rights by imposing deadly sanctions. The US claims to want to end the Korean War, yet in the same breath, the US imposes greater sanctions as an act of warfare, knowing full well that North Korea sees lifting sanctions as a precondition to negotiations to ending the war. We must not be fooled by the rhetoric of the United States, but look instead at its actions. And despite these repressive US policies, North Korea has resisted sanctions and managed to hold its own and provide for its people. The North Korean people themselves continue to stay resilient and adapt to the many challenges they face, through remarkable advancements in agriculture, energy, and textile and steel production. Sanctions will continue to serve as a major barrier to renewing peace talks between the two Koreas. We must organize against imperialist sanctions in order to achieve peace, liberation, and reunification in Korea.
The People's Forum, one of the most famous progressive activist gathering place in New York City, they have meeting rooms, library, coffee house, and book publisher.
Next up, we're going to hear about another country, resilient and determined, by Roger Wareham of the December 12th movement, who has organized solidarity with Zimbabwe under sanctions for decades. The largest number, actually, of sanctioned countries are African countries. It's a new colonialism. It's meant to divide and redivide, but particularly the campaign around Zimbabwe, I think, stands out some of the strongest of the sanctions. So, Roger.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting us to participate in this campaign, the campaign inviting us to participate in the campaign. Until recently, particularly in the left, the sanctions on Zimbabwe were not really well known. And as Sarah was pointing out, the U.S. rationale for imposing sanctions is that the targeted country or the targeted people pose a national threat to U.S. security or pose a threat to U.S. national security. The only threat that Zimbabwe represented at the time the sanctions were imposed was that they really had the temerity and the audacity to just take their land back from the descendants of the settlers who stole it. That was it. Until that time, if you look back at Zimbabwe's independence struggle and when they achieved independence in 1980, it was a compromise that was reached. They were about to win on the battlefield, but the South Africans who supported the Rhodesians had basically were saying that if the armed struggle didn't stop in Zimbabwe, they were going to continue to bomb civilians in the countries that had supported that struggle, in Zambia, Tanzania. And so a compromise was reached at Lancaster House in Great Britain in 1980. And part of that compromise was that there would be one man, one vote, majority rule, but that for the first 10 years, the representatives of the white minority, and they were truly a minority in that country, would have a certain number of seats delegated in their legislature, in the parliament. In that same period of time, there would be an agreement of one seller, one buyer, that the whites who own the land would sell the land back to Zimbabweans, which is an interesting concept, that the thief would also be able to benefit from their thievery. That agreement was underwritten with the understanding that the money to pay the settlers would come from Great Britain and the United States. For some reason, who knows, I mean, how the United States got involved in that, that's the old kith and kin rap that they maintain to this day. So you rub my back, I'll rub your back. At that point in time, President Robert Mugabe, who had been portrayed in the Western press as the George Washington of his country, he was a consummate Democrat. He was the model that African leaders should model themselves after, according to the West. At the point in time when Zimbabwe said, no, we're taking our land back, then he morphed from George Washington to Adolf Hitler. I mean, they began to portray him as the Black Hitler, and they imposed the sanctions. And very interestingly, one of the sponsors of the resolution of the Zimbabwe Democracy and Economic Recovery Act of 2001 was Hillary Clinton.
Burning Books, a famous local anarchist Marxist bookstore in Buffalo, New York, carry many activist books printed in the United States.
They are harmful to the entire planet, and we're going to talk about how we can fight them, because this isn't just informational, but we're going to talk about some of the ongoing campaigns that are actively fighting U.S. sanctions and imperialism around the world. And we're going to talk about why we as working class people here in the imperial core should care about this.
Haiti, Iran, Iraq, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, Laos, Lebanon, Liberia, Libya, Mali, Moldova, Montenegro, Myanmar, Nicaragua, Palestine, Paraguay, Russia, Serbia, Somalia, South Sudan, Sudan, Syria, Tunisia, Turkey, Uganda, and Venezuela.
Today, December 10th, which is celebrated around the world, if not in the U.S., as the International Human Rights Day. Ironic in the sense that what we are talking about and what we will further explore is the systematic attempt on the part of the U.S. settler colonial state to deny the most elementary human rights to masses of people in this country and around the world. It's important to note that the U.S. is the leader of the Western Bloc, and its objective is to maintain the global hegemony of the pan-European white supremacist colonial capitalist patriarchy that emerged in 1492 and represents the hegemonic force that we are all struggling against today. In order to maintain that hegemony, they have decided that they are going to engage in open forms of warfare. And it's important to note that this sanctioned weapon is in fact a weapon of war. It has devastating consequences for societies throughout the world, and it results in death and destruction in a real way.
Since February this year, the imperialist powers of the US, Canada, the European Union, and Britain have imposed massive, unprecedented, unilateral, and illegal sanctions against Russia. These sanctions are very wide-ranging. Russia's been cut out of SWIFT, which is the global messaging network for international payments, in order to try and cripple the Russian economy. Russian banks have had their assets frozen, over $1 trillion worth of assets. Biden ordered a ban on Russian energy imports to the US. Easy enough for him to do, given that the US was importing precious little Russian energy in the first place. But the story in Europe is much more complicated. Germany, for example, has been reliant on Russian energy for more than 50 years. It's kind of interesting to observe here that no countries whatsoever were sanctioned as a result of the West's genocidal wars on Iraq, or Afghanistan, or Libya, or Yugoslavia. You know, there's this liberal narrative going around that, well, Russia's invaded another country and, we've got to do something, therefore sanctions are justified. Even if you accept that argument, and obviously you should at least ask why these rules don't apply when it's the US and its allies that are doing the invading. The corner of Biden's foreign policy has been to essentially recreate the Cold War alliance, when the freedom-loving West united under US leadership against the evil commies of the East. And now Biden is looking to get the band back together, to revive that same project, a hybrid war against socialism, against sovereignty, and against multipolarity. It's a manifestation of the project for a new American century. Now, that was a neocon project, a neocon concept, a Rumsfeld, Cheney, Wolfowitz concept, but it's been taken up by successive Democratic and Republican administrations. As far as foreign policy is concerned, there's only one party, the War Party.
Today, I want to talk about the effects of U.S. sanctions or unilateral coercive measures on the developing nations in the Middle East. The group of countries I'm going to talk about, Iran, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and critically Palestine, can be referred to as the axis of resistance. They are the axis of resistance to the Israeli occupation of Palestine and to Western imperialism. In 2006, U.S. sanctions banned companies from doing business with the Palestinian Authority. Public schools and hospitals, along with other government services, were targeted by these sanctions. Meanwhile, individual members of the PA were enriched under the table, so they will enforce the Israeli and U.S. policies. Today, following a fierce 10-year proxy war, Syria has 1/3 of its territory occupied by the U.S. and its allies. Turkish-backed terrorists continue to control Syria's Idlib province, while Israel has annexed the Golan and routinely bombs Syrian territory from there. A proxy force led by the U.S. allied Kurds administers an area in the northeast of the country, which includes most of Syria's oil wells, their wheat-producing region, and a significant water source, the Euphrates. The area is protected by approximately 1,000 U.S. soldiers. With the country devastated by bombing raids and terrorist attacks, the U.S. placed new sanctions on Syria. These sanctions, ironically defined by the U.S. Caesar Civilian Protection Act, include what are called secondary sanctions, which punish any country or business that provides any support to the primary sanctioned country. Meanwhile, the Caesar sanctions are specifically tailored to prohibit reconstruction in Syria. They have not only destroyed the Syrian economy, but in conjunction with the theft of Syrian oil and wheat resources, they have devastated the population. Due to the secondary sanctions, international companies are afraid to provide any resources due to the fear of U.S. retaliation. Since Syrian banking and much of their import-export business was either directly with Lebanon or processed through Lebanese banks, the secondary sanctions on Syria brought down the already fragile and corrupt economy of Lebanon as well. And with the collapse of the banks in Lebanon, the equally unstable and corrupt government has collapsed as well. Elena Duhan, the United Nations Rapporteur on Secondary Sanctions, recently visited Syria. On her return, she demanded that the sanctions on Syria be lifted immediately.